So one of the things that all Georgians are kind of grappling with right now is that we've got a huge Senate race coming up, and many of us were completely innovated, motivated, ready to get everything done under Stacey Abrams. A lot of us saw that, it would be crushed out. Her race would be crushed out by the powers that be, that by the white supremacist hold in the state on a systemic level. At every single level, from voting machines to voting lines, everything that the Voting Rights Act basically counteracted in our state. We knew Stacey Abrams was not going to be able to overcome these kind of systematic abuses of white supremacy, but it unleashed, I think, a new optimism in our state that we haven't seen, certainly in my lifetime here. What do you guys think is going to happen with this next Senate race?
It's going to be a hot mess. I think if anything, we've seen kind of what we saw the template of what's going to happen long term for just Georgia politics, which is a lot of closing down of polls, a lot of questions about security and voting, and then just apathy. I think that's going to be the more important than anything else. I think a lot of people were excited for Stacey Abrams, and when she got that close, and then we know for sure that the election probably had some real compromised positions. I think a lot of people might sit out this Senate race just because they feel like, okay, we got close, and then this is kind of what's going to continue. So I think that's going to be a harder thing.
And I think it's hard, too, because Stacey Abrams is one of a kind. And she's absolutely a wonderful politician and a wonderful motivator that was able to get people out to the polls who have never done that before. And I don't think we can count on that kind of person motivating us out to vote. If we want change, we need to have a movement of change that isn't predicated on one specific person. How do we get there? I wish I do.
Do either one of you have candidates in your mind who have not announced anything yet, but you're kind of holding out hope that they might?
No, actually, I don't. Just because so many people who are running now, it seems like the strategy on both sides, the Democrats and Republicans, are to go with a name at this point. And I think that even if you're an upstart, the names right now are already bringing in some big donors right now. So I think that's keeping a lot of people back.
Mm-hmm. I think what we're going to see is that all of the Democrats are going to run in the primary in March. And then whoever doesn't get that nomination is going to run in November for Isaacson's seat. My fear is that that's going to flood the field and split the Democratic vote, and we're going to end up with a runoff with 2 Republicans.
Right.
So that's what I'm afraid of. I don't think any of the candidates we have right now are doing the kind of work that Stacey Abrams did, that kind of movement building, grassroots level work. I think they are, they have names out there, and some of them have fairly good track records, but I don't think they're doing the kind of work that she did that got her so close.
And we have several candidates that have done great work on the local level, but a statewide race for that level of office is an unknown.
Yeah, it's a big lift, especially for Perdue's seat. Perdue is well liked by businesses because he does exactly what they need. But what we need is a politician and a leader in the Senate who's going to do what the people need, not what the corporations need.
When we see these other states that have had these formerly Republican districts switch in the last few years to social Democrats, we see the power again of young people, of millennials, of social media, of film reaching these voters. Do you think that there's something that filmmakers in Georgia or people who are involved at any level of creativity, of creating art, can start helping with politics?
I think that they can be. I think there's been a lot of big name celebrity artists, but I think the local level really hasn't been engaged at all with the artist community. I look at some of the things like Living Walls and that organization, or all of the artists out of Castleberry, who for the most part have done maybe some individual things, but they have a lot of pull both in social media and in real life and within the global artist community, and they have not been really engaged at all for anyone to do anything. I think that's low-hanging fruit if you want to get engagement out sooner.
That's a great point, because I always think about this from the perspective of thinking about how important art was during the New Deal. That art was key to bringing people into supporting these socialist type plans that before they saw the artwork on it and really in some ways you could call it propaganda, but it was a way to communicate to people in a different format, a way to communicate to people who were politically apathetic, who just saw the government essentially abandon them during the Great Depression to bring them back in at a different level. And we need to start tapping into these local artists.
I think of Fabian Williams' wonderful Stacey Abrams mural on Edgewood, right? And how wonderful that was with at the time it said vote across the top of it. And I think that did tell people, like, this is something that we care about. And this is something that is important for all of our lives, not just the political sphere.
Right. And I think to even add to that with the Fabian Williams piece, that it was in the right place, which is some of the things I think people kind of forget, which is it's one thing to knock on doors, and that's important to call people, but having art where young people actually are and where they cultivate themselves is super important. The other thing I mentioned, I haven't mentioned yet, is that the online portion of artists like haven't been engaged as well. There's like a pretty viral TikTok video right now of this young girl who just kind of breaks down different things. One of which was an Oxford comma. Another one is just like what trickle down taxes. The girl's probably like 17. And but like that idea of like, you will never reach a certain level of 17-year-old, but that 17-year-old could probably reach every kid in the zip code because they know how to kind of interact with art online. And I think we've seen it been weaponized, but we haven't seen it really been used for a positive thing yet.
Right. If people can use YouTube and all sorts of channels to recruit people to white supremacy, then it can obviously be used the other way, right?
Right. And it's not just using YouTube. I think that some people get kind of misconfused with this, using the platform versus the message. So the message has always been consistent, whether or not unfortunately, it's been white supremacy via memes, online chat rooms, video games even. The message is still the same, even though they're just communicating differently. I think that if you're going to have something for 2020 or 2022, it needs to be get out to vote. This is my Democratic candidate, and we're going to keep pushing out content related to that. The only politician I think who does that well is probably Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez. But I think she's somebody born in the internet, and most people aren't, at least on a political level.
Right. So even older candidates are going to have to start really bringing younger people in to work with them and figure out how to talk to the younger generations.
Absolutely.
Now, Sara, with your work on public housing, what do you see as the next biggest factor in public housing in rural areas? Do you think about that or interact with that at all?
Sure. So I think a lot of people think of housing affordability as being an urban issue. What we know is that housing affordability is an issue across the country in urban and rural areas. That sometimes it's not even renters, it's that homeowners can't afford the places where they live. We're not building any new public housing in our country. That's not what we fund. We use Section 8 vouchers and other kinds of programs, tax credits to help build affordable housing. But what we don't do is a good job of talking about affordability across the country, across the state in particular. And I think that comes back to this messaging piece, that when we talk about affordable housing, people get a certain picture in their mind. And they think about especially Black people in the city. But I think what we need to talk about is housing affordability, that it's about everybody being able to have a home that they can afford and that allows them to live without having to make difficult choices about paying for their food or paying for their children's education, paying for their student loans versus paying for their rent or their mortgage. So especially in rural areas, we're seeing a lot of problems, as we've talked about, with you might be able to afford your mortgage, but you can't afford the car to get you to work. And how do we deal with those kinds of issues? And I think that those are much bigger and thornier policy issues that we're not going to solve without massive public investment. One of the things I always say about affordable housing is that affordable housing is there as a market-based solution, the way we do it right now. But we're not going to get the market to solve a problem that the market creates.
Right. So do either of you see the South and our state really making huge changes without some kind of federal intervention? Or do you think it's got to come from the federal government first?
I do, but I think it's not going to be from where we're thinking about. And this is going to sound weird, but I think that it will probably take somebody like who's getting super capitalized. So I look at what Airbnb is did, and there's another place in Atlanta called Pats, but it's going to be some Silicon Valley backed thing that tries to attempt to solve affordable housing. But I don't think that's going to be the overall like change, but it's going to be the thing kind of like what Uber did for mass transit, which is like, we're going to get backed by venture capital and we're going to produce a different solution. And over time, it'll be a bit of a change, but I'm with you. I don't think the federal government right now, just because of the current administration, I don't think there's going to be a whole lot of push for that.
Right. Certainly not in the current, but in the future, hopefully.
So there is a bill right now actually in Congress that would increase low-income housing tax credits by 50%, which that is the #1 maker of affordable housing, new affordable
Oh,
housing
wow.
development. So that is before the House and Senate right now. There are live bills that people could call their senators and support. But again, I mean, I'm an affordable housing developer. I build things with LIHTC dollars. And so, I support that program. And it is the best program that we have going right now for developing new affordable housing. But it's also a market-based program, and it relies on private development. And whenever you're relying on private developers, that means that developers have to take their cut because we've got to keep our lights on too. But I don't think that that's going to go all the way to solving the problem. And things like pad split or Airbnb, they solve some problems and they create other new ones. But I think what we need with affordable housing is we need all of these kinds of solutions. We talk about needing a lot of 2% solutions, right? You're not going to find one thing that's going to solve it all. But if we can layer in all of these different ideas and let them all correct their one little piece of it, then maybe we can make a difference.
Right. The other thing I'm thinking about too is that we're going to probably get some other traction in place that we didn't expect. So I'm looking at kind of what's going on right now with what may or may not be happening with HUD, with just right now, just will it be funded fully? Will it not be funded? And then some of the things they're trying to push through. I think the idea is supposed to open up opportunities. And I'm not sure how that's going to shake out necessarily, but there could be some general benefits to it. Like the idea of opportunity zones on paper seems like it should be working. We'll see how the reality of that actually works out.
Yeah, it's difficult because it's one of those programs that doesn't pair well with like the LIHTC program. It's something that was created, I think, out of good faith, and then it was used as a tax shelter, essentially.
Right.
So it's difficult when you have new programs that then get subverted by the time they're implemented.
I think that's going to be another issue. It's whoever takes the White House next, that should be something. I think that's one of the few rallying points that everyone across the political perspective really wants. People want a nice home. People want to get equity in their home. They want to kind of level up or level down in life, depending on where they are. Whoever can make that easier and affordable is going to be probably the president until they decide not to be. So I think that's got to be the platform. It's one of the few things that unifies the country.
I mean, what we've seen with millennials moving back in with family, we've also seen the rise in multifamily housing, right? Like America's finally kind of catching up with the rest of the world who have traditionally lived in multifamily units.
Right.
How are you guys dealing with that?
Right. So the firm that I work for, Tapestry Development Group, we only develop multifamily housing and only multifamily rental housing. And I think outside of the affordable housing world, we're seeing this rise of renters by choice. People who, whether it's a true choice because it's what they want, or if it's a limited choice because it's what they can afford with whatever other reasons they have, people are looking at renter options as being something positive that they want. When it comes to these kinds of rental products or even multifamily in general, though, I think what we're missing is that middle, right? We call it the missing middle for a reason, because when we think about cities of the past, they had a mix of duplexes and triplexes. They might have small multifamily 10 units right next to single family homes. And we've zoned those out. And that was an intentional policy that was made. And it's an intentional policy that can be unmade. Because if we're going to have housing affordability, we have got to increase our density. And that doesn't mean that everybody needs to live in an apartment, but it does mean that we need to get away from this idea that everybody needs a single family home with a big yard in the front and the back.
And in doing that, I'm already anticipating the pushback on that, because for the last 50 or so years, the American idea of what a home looks like is that house in the suburbs with the white picket fence and 2 dogs. That's going to have to change. And I think even with all the best policy, and if we have all the money to do it, if people's attitudes haven't been coerced into thinking differently about housing, we might be in a much bigger mess, because people typically, when they see change, they resist it or they go against it. And so I think it's going to be about messaging to show the benefits from an economic perspective, an environmental perspective, and a lifestyle perspective on what affordable housing and the variety options that you have to bring.
Right. I even think about psychologically how this issue has been bandied about as the cause of so much of these white males, white supremacist men's anger, right? Is that they don't have a job where they can afford their own house. They don't have a job where they can go out and live on their own, right? That they're still dependent upon their parents, whether they're 21 or 31. And instead of it ever being explained as a systemic, fundamental error by our country, something that this is a state that most people can't claw their way out of. It's not a personal failure. That messaging has not been there. And I think that's part of the reason you see, not only the kind of death rate in white America spiking, whether it be through addiction or suicide or different gun deaths, but it's also it's the reason we have the addiction anyway, right? It's all the psychological malaise. It's all being constantly, thinking that your economic situation is your personal failing.
I think we have to go back to the post-war years, right? Right after World War II, when white America was suddenly booming and having all kinds of opportunities that we never had before. And those opportunities were because of white supremacy, both on the backs of Black people and other people of color in the United States, and also the colonialism that came along with the Cold War. And so we have to think about the fact that these realities that we as white people were socialized into, of being able to have a good job right out of college, being able to afford a house, being able to, as a white man, to get a woman of your choice. Those are all false promises that were built on the backs of other people. And so even though it feels like something is being taken away from us, really all we're doing is leveling the playing field back to where it should have been in the first place.
And on top of that, it was something that was kind of false from the beginning, even going back to like the post-World War II period. The U.S., for the most part, everyone kind of was on the same, for the most part, economic level, regardless of where you were. Once you start using public policy and federal dollars to incentivize one thing for 50 years, you start to believe that that is, like you said, the way of life. And that was never the case. So if we start putting those dollars back into other different things, I think we might have a very different society, but people who benefited before may not benefit the same way they did prior.
Right.
So.
And that's what I have been thinking about a lot lately in talking about reparations, not only for the descendants of the enslaved, but a second kind of reparations that I conceptualize as coming about under basically a third Reconstruction, which would then seek not only to have policies that would change things, but actually have some kind of a watchdog agency or a panel of historians or whatever to really think about, okay, this is what the policy is meant to do, but when it's enacted, does it do the opposite? Does it take from the poor and give to the rich? And it's a fascinating subject because, again, you can have all these policies with the best intentions, but there are so few times in American history that they actually pan out the way that they're intended to.
So I think when it comes to housing, they panned out exactly the way they were intended to. They enabled white home ownership, and that's what they were built to do. But I think with some of these things that, we have a lot of Democratic candidates. Many of them have housing plans that are essentially a form of reparations to say that the way that we administered the federal mortgage programs in the 60s and 70s and all the way up until really the recession were wrong and discriminatory. And that we need to address those with real dollars. And that's a federal policy that created real impacts on Black wealth in particular. And the only way to rectify that is to put some money back towards Black wealth.
Right. I think that's going to be something going forward. I think that how we actually go about, like you said, with reparations is going to be interesting because we've had an attempt at trying to do before, which was cut radically short. And so I think housing is a good starting point, but I think it's going to take generationally some kind of plan and series of plans to kind of work this out. So what that looks like, I'm not sure about, but like you said, I'm actually for the idea of a regulatory body and a governing body to kind of keep reviewing the process because if it goes too far off track, it won't benefit anyone else as well.
And I think that's one of the ways that our current bifurcation of our political system is really inhibiting not just the passage of legislation, but future fixes, right? I think about the Affordable Care Act, where we went into that with its passage knowing that there were going to need to be things that would be tweaked and changed, and we weren't able to do it. And so that's actually created certain ways that is more harmful than what we had before. Not that we shouldn't have the Affordable Care Act, but that we need to be able to correct it, and we need to have somebody that's watching out for those kinds of things.
Yeah, and I think that in terms of like where we're going as a country, I think that right now it seems like we're going really in polar opposite directions. I think there is a logical end to that. How that ends is going to be more interesting. I think it's going to end really because essentially people are just fed up with being like either priced out, unaffordable, and they're just tired of it. And who gets that particular policy, I think is going to be more interesting. I think that there will be some candidate, whether on the right or the left, who's somewhat similar to like Elizabeth Warren in the sense that I'm going to have a series of plans, and that plan is going to be how we go about America. The real question is that person going to be somebody like Elizabeth Warren or herself, or somebody on the opposite end of the spectrum with a series of plans that permanently kind of cripple the U.S. for people's growth? And I think that person, the planning person, will be the person who wins out.
Right. And I mean, that's something I come back to constantly, that if America was so easily led down the path of authoritarianism, and I should qualify white America, right? White America was so easily led. What would have happened had we had actually, competent people on a policy level, really, in the White House these last few years? I mean, it would have been disastrous, even more disastrous than it is now.
I hesitate to say that there's any silver linings about President Trump and the things that he's done, but his incompetence has stopped him from doing some of the worst things. So I'm thankful that he's been at least limited in that way.
Yeah, and it's not just that part of it. It's the fact that right now, when you have essentially that you have all of the pieces in order to do something, you haven't been able to do anything for real. It's a testament to what limits people actually have for governance. And I think that that's been one of the also silver linings. So where people will let you do a lot of things, but it's not unchecked. And even though right now we still have some issues with the current president and the current U.S. Senate, there's been enough pushback on certain things to at least keep it semi-level, or at least like not as completely inequitable as it has been.
Right. The one thing I've always said on podcasts through the last few years is that, at least from a historical perspective, when you have someone so far to the right, that there's a chance right after they're gone to swing that pendulum back far to the left. And I think that really, for the first time in my lifetime, certainly, that this time is ripe right now to like really push through a progressive agenda in the next few years, and hopefully the Third Reconstruction. But that's something I also think about, that we need to think about implementing at a state level, especially in the Deep South.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, the state level is going to be harder because I think right now we're seeing a lot more entrenchment with typically very staunch old guard conservatism across the board. And even I think that's even kind of going in the face of what I see with like a younger guard of conservatism. I'm thinking people like Ana Navarro or Marco Rubio, which they still have some issues that I generally have a problem with, but like there's a lot more leeway. But on the governorship level, it's almost completely going hard, right? And that just does not work out historically, like at all. And I think people should kind of start being aware of what happens when you keep going too far to the right.
And I think, too, when it comes to the state level, people get excited about the president, and there's good reason for that. But most of our lives are governed by the states, and we have to start thinking about state level politics. And people also talk about local politics being important, which they absolutely are, but local governments are often limited by the state. So thinking about these on kind of a state level is really important when we think about what kind of future we want. And to bring us back around to the film industry, one of the reasons I don't support the film industry boycott is because I think things change when people stay and change them.
Right.
And I would like to see that film industry support be for good change that will help make the Georgia we want to have.
And even to back to that too, Bob Iger, who's the current CEO of Disney, is one of the largest individual donors to the Democratic Party. And I think having somebody like that in the state of Georgia could really help out a lot. When you have that level of personal income, personal wealth, who can donate directly to Democratic causes, is something that you want to have in the state of Georgia and not just clustered in California.
Absolutely. I mean, a lot of times these boycotts, which I understand they're well-intentioned, but again, and then you even just think of the workers. You think of the people losing their jobs here, the people losing income here from the film industry that had nothing to do with the actual law, that most of us don't want it, didn't want it. And anyway, I think there's this progressive swell, and we've just got to get a handle on it and figure out how to get it out there and reach the masses, not only young but old, which will be a whole different topic. But let's try to end things on a positive note. What do you think good can come out of this in the next few years? Do you have any hope or faith left in the system at this point?
I always have hope and faith in people. Systems can change. The good that is going to come out of it, and on the state level regarding transit, what we started out with is there will be transit in Atlanta. It's just a matter of when. I'm really hopeful about that, and I really think there's going to be a lot of progress. I do see a lot more people kind of waking up to the idea of what transit is supposed to look like and realize that we can't build as many roads. I'm also really hopeful that people start to see that with the current form of governance that we have both on the state and a national level, that actually is kind of restrictive in terms of growing what America is supposed to be, in terms of a place for anyone to have opportunity or to grow economically, that people are going to start seeing, okay, we might need to move back from this and go to a different direction. So I'm hopeful about that. So that's where I'm at right now.
And I feel hopeful about young people being involved in politics, even before they can vote. That I think that there is already a progressive swell in Georgia, as you said, but people talk about Georgia turning purple. I think Georgia is already purple. It's just a matter of getting people out to the polls and making sure that their votes get counted. And I think if we can make those kinds of changes, that we're going to have a very different state in the next few years.
Well, thank you both, King Williams, Sara Patenaude. Thank you so much for being here. This is Meritocracy. Hit subscribe and talk to you soon.